especially when I was managing behavior team, where we would demonize patrons, right? Very much so, like, I cannot believe this dog was brought to the dog park. I specifically told them not to bring this dog to the dog park, and they did, and then now we've got a dog at the vet clinic, right? And here's the thing, I share this often, it's a vulnerable moment, but like, I make mistakes. I overestimated a situation. My dog bit a child in my home, and I am a trainer and behavior consultant with a ton of experience, and I let my guard down in this moment, and thank goodness it was superficial. But like, if I'm going to make a mistake, our adopters are going to make mistakes, right? And we have to be okay with that, and we have to give them the information to set them up for success, knowing that if management fails, or like when management fails, are we okay with that outcome? We're going to talk a lot about that when we get to the risk scale. So, additional adopter expectations is that they want to take the dog to various places, regardless if the dog would like to accompany them to those various places. They want to leave their dogs home for several hours. This is really challenging when we're dealing with separation-related problem behaviors, otherwise known as separation anxiety. The dog is friendly, they can introduce it to people and other animals, and they can just take it on a neighborhood walk to provide enrichment. I don't know if anyone's owned a cattle dog before, anyone's owned an adolescent male shepherd, or like a high energy lab. Like, a neighborhood walk might not cut it. And for the most part, when I see a lot of my clients, we are working on the specific behavior issue, but the behavior issue is a product that the dog's actual breed specific and species specific needs are not being met. And so that is not necessarily solved by just addressing the jumping on the table. If the dog's needs are not being met, it's going to pop up somewhere else, right? And so we want to really take a look at what the dog needs as a whole. And neighborhood walks, to be completely honest, are not necessary. They don't cut it for a lot of dogs. Okay, so my dear friend and colleague, Lisa Molinax, also a certified dog behavior consultant, she did this really cool survey. She had about 40,000 people following her on Facebook, and she did a Survey Monkey, and Survey Monkey stopped it at 1,200 people, I guess, because that was like the max, but there were tons of people that wanted to be able to fill this out. And what she learned from this really lengthy survey about, she was trying to understand, like, how many people are modifying their life, their behavior, are they taking their dogs to the veterinarians? Are they spending a ton of money on training? And what she learned is that 38% spent over $1,000 to modify their dog's behavior. And I think it's really important to know that when we say modify, we are not saying fix, right? So I want you to think about this, that modification is that we are reducing the probability of the problematic behavior from occurring. We never like break the dog of it or, you know, get rid of any behavior, right? Think about like, I mean, it's similar to someone goes to therapy, right? Like if I'm worried about something, if I have a fear of flying, I might still always deal with that, but I have tools in my tool belt to help me cope with that, right? So $1,000 to modify. This is not like fixing a leaky faucet, right? This is reducing the probability. 35% said they delay vet visits because of behavior, no surprise. And 64.8% modified their home or yard to manage behavior. No surprise here too. Most adopters want to manage. I'm a trainer and I want to manage. I don't love to come home dealing with my clients, shelter dogs, and being like, you know what, I'm gonna do like a whole training protocol for A, B, and C behavior for my dog, right? Lots of times we just manage things and that's totally okay. But what we need to tell our clients is that when we manage something, it's not like we're getting rid of the behavior. We're not teaching the dog anything. We're just reducing the probability of that behavior happening, but that behavior is always a choice, right? So we also have to think about the individual community. And in your document, which we're not going to get to right now, so you don't have to pull it up, but this placement considerations document is similar to this. Like, what does our community want? Right? So do we keep putting up dogs that need to be single dog homes and nobody comes in to adopt them because of A, B, and C reason? It doesn't mean we euthanize these dogs, but how can we do some education around the benefits of having a single animal home? What can we do in terms of like adoption promotions? What can we do to help support that animal? We have to really ask the question, what is your community willing to take on, right? Are they willing to take on risks? And for the most part, I would say that Colorado does a really good job. Like, people are coming and adopting animals, and I'm like, wow, like that, like, good on you. Like, you're gonna take that animal. And so it's important for us to be really transparent with our adopters so that they know what they're walking into, but also be aware of what they are willing to take on. So, modern behavior assessment, the behavior evaluation or behavior assessment that we are so familiar with, like Assess-A-Pet, Match Up To, SAFER evaluation, right? It's where you put the animal in a room and you sort of expose them to stimuli or to triggers in the environment to see how they respond to that, right? And that is, I mean, we used that back in the day when we had to make decisions. We had a lot of animals, and we were just like, we're going to run each animal through this test and see if they pass or fail, right? That is an old school way of looking at it, right? Because what behavior is happening all the time. So it would be like if you did an Assess-A-Pet on me before my coffee, and you did an Assess-A-Pet evaluation on me after my coffee, like, you're going to get two different Marissa's, right? Like, when my partner comes down, it's like he doesn't talk to me until he has his coffee, and then when he has his coffee, I can't get him to shut up, right? So it's two totally different beings that show up based on the conditions in the environment. So it's really tricky. So I have a lot of shelters, especially in rural Colorado, that are like, we don't have people to do an assessment, and we don't have a room to do an assessment. We don't have Assess-A-Hand. We don't have all these things. And I'm like, fine, we don't actually need that. What we need is points in time that cue you to start to observe the dog's behavior, and then we start to take notes, right? So the more modern assessment is really taking a look at the dog as an individual, and we're going to do that with Monty. So what do you think contributes to behavior? Like, what are some things that we know? What makes us behave? Genetics, yeah, I love that genetics is like coming up more and more. Genetics, yep. What'd you say? Socialization. What else? Environment, huge, right? Like, we like to think, our egos like to think we are cueing everything for our dogs, and yet, like, yeah, we're like a sliver of the equation, right? What else? So environment, genetics, health. Yeah, I don't have health on here. That's insane. Well, that's part of the conditions, but yes. So environment, health. I heard something else. Consequences. Yeah. So conditions of the situation really impact behavior. And so stuff that I'm really, really excited about, that I love working with my clients, is I teach them about conditions, right? I teach them about, like, okay, it is where you walked. It is the types of dogs that were barking from the fence. It is the fact that your dog just experienced like 3 different bikers that rode by. It's the fact that your dog is limping because he injured himself, so he doesn't feel well. It's the fact that you are stressed that your dog is barking and lunging on leash, and then therefore you engage differently with your dog by tensing up on the leash, and you know, all those embarrassing feelings, they impact how we behave, and then that impacts our dog's behavior, right? So I like to say that there's like internal antecedents. So there's internal things that are causing us to respond in a certain way. The same thing with our dogs, right? Dogs are feeling a certain way about something, and then they are reacting. And then we're in this like loop, and sometimes that loop is good, and sometimes it is a hot mess, right? Who here has a dog that like, if they start barking and you're like, leave it, and you get really, really tense if they start barking more, right? Like they're just feeding off of all the conditions that are in their environment, right? In addition to genetics. Genetics play a huge role. We're going to talk about that for Monty's case. Puppy socialization, so what happens between 0 to 12 to 14 weeks, depending on the research that you look at. What's important, and I always give this a plug, puppy socialization, how we used to look at it was very much that like, okay, we're gonna play pass the puppy, and I need you to take your puppy to all these different places, and it doesn't matter how they're feeling, it's just exposure therapy, right? We're just exposing them to a lot of things, and it turns out it really matters. Right? It's not like they might be able to recover a little bit faster than a dog that's beyond 14 weeks, but it does matter that if you are taking your puppy to experiences and they are fearful, it doesn't mean that that's healthy socialization, right? Which is something very different in the last like 10 years or so. Their reinforcement history, so their learning history, right? So what I was saying is that you all have a lens about your learning history, right? Like if I have let's say I'm going to use this breed because no one uses this breed, but let's say I have met a ton of Goldens that were just aggressive across the board, right? I'm going to have a bias towards Goldens, right? That's my learning history. I have experienced Goldens barking and lunging at me every single time, right? And so we all have a learning history the same way that our dogs have a learning history. Prenatal learning and neonatal conditions. So this is for like our moms that are in shelter that are really stressed. There are a lot of stress hormones like coursing through their system that's impacting the fetuses as well. And then what happens when they come out and what experiences they're having or not having around their litter mates and their mom, right? We see a lot of interesting behavior issues with dogs later on, or even during puppyhood that didn't have that exposure to other litter mates, didn't learn that bite inhibition, and just have, just some really interesting behavior issues because of that. So the question is nature versus nurture, it's both, right? And so genetics plays a huge role, and we'll talk about that, but we can cultivate positive experiences. And the environment determines a lot about behavior. That's the thing that we can see. So most of my clients will say, well, why is he doing it? I adopted him. He's always been doing this behavior. Why is he doing it? Sometimes we don't know why. We just can see that he's doing it. We can see that he's conflicted. So one of the ways in which they learn is through classical conditioning. They're making associations all the time, right? So they are saying like your treat bag predicts food. Right, the sight of the grooming brush predicts maybe like discomfort, and so therefore they have a negative association to the grooming brush. Right, so that's one way in which they learn. This would be a negative association, right? So when the dog is learning by classical conditioning or making those associations, the question I imagine them asking is, how does this thing make me feel? How does this thing plus this thing plus this thing in the environment, how are these conditions making me feel? And then therefore they react based off of their emotions. And this is happening all the time. So whether we're in training mode or not, dogs are forming these associations all the time. They're also learning by their environment about what are the consequences that happen after the behavior. Right, and so how we talk about this is ABC, so it's antecedent, behavior, consequence. The antecedent, super important for us to know, is what is cueing the behavior to happen. When I step inside my car, the antecedent could be I'm holding my keys. I am sitting in the car. What's the behavior? I put the key in the ignition. What's the consequence? I get to drive the car. If that consequence is good for me, I'm going to continue to get in the car and put the keys in the ignition. Right? That behavior works for me. Can you imagine saying, hey, Lacey, I know that you want to drive your car, and like, I know that you want to put the key in the ignition, but like, you got to stop because it's annoying me, right? Like, that's what we do to dogs. Like the behavior that is highly functional for them. They're like, what do you mean you have a problem with me barking out the window? The stranger keeps walking, highly functional, right? And we're like, yeah, well, it's really startling to my nervous system. So I'm a primate, and like I just, I really can't have that, right? It's like they don't care. It's a functional behavior, and it's a big ask when we say, hey person, hey dog, even client, hey client, I know that you use a shock collar all these years. I'm going to ask you not to do that because we're going to try a different route. And they're like, it's worked for me for all the dogs in the past, right? So it is hard to modify a behavior, especially when there's a long learning history and especially when it's functional. And that goes for us as well, right? So I imagine the dog is asking, like, what happens if I do this? If I bark, the scary thing goes away. If I hop on the counter, I get access to the bread box, right? Like, they're trying to figure out what is working for them in their environment, and then they're going to continue behaving. It's the same for us, right? Like, I'm sure none of you are coming into work for free, right? You're all coming into work too, unless you're a volunteer, and thank you so much for being here. I always have to remember that there are volunteers. So really important to know that all behavior has a function, and this is why it's important for us to take a look at behavior, like assessing behavior in the moments that the animal is there, right? So we are assessing behavior from behavior history, asking really good questions from the pet parent to ask them, who is this dog? Who is this cat, right? Asking really, really good questions and then making some really good ongoing observations. It's a lot more work, right? Like I'm working with Rightful Animal Shelter right now to find ways, so find antecedents to cue their staff to observe and enter notes, right? Because that ABC thing works for us too. It's just applied behavior analysis, right? So it's okay. I'm feeding the dogs is the antecedent. So I'm preparing the food that cues me to observe the dog that I'm feeding, and then I'm going to walk over and I'm going to add in notes, right? You can't just say to your staff, hey, can you guys start observing dogs and adding in notes? That is never going to happen, right? So we need a system to say, okay, we're observing the dog at time of intake. We're observing the dog when we approach the kennel. We're observing the dog during leashing. We're observing the dog when we walk him outside. We're observing how he responds to a novel person walking in the parking lot. We're observing how he responds to a novel dog, right? So it's more about thinking about who is this dog in the moment as he or she experiences the environment, instead of just saying we've got 15 minutes, we're in a small room, and I'm just going to push and push and push and push and push. I'm not saying there isn't a place for that. What I'm saying is that if you're just doing that, it's a little sliver in time, right? And it's not necessarily the full picture of that dog. So step 2 is once we have all that information, we want to run it through a risk assessment, right? And we want to look at the behavior choices of these dogs in this particular moment. How risky are they, right? And if management fails, what is the risk that we're willing to assume? And this is where the risk assessment tool comes in handy. And then step 3, we want to determine flow and outcome. So what does this dog need? Access to medical resources, access to behavior resources, transfer because we don't have those, right? Like what is this dog's flow through our system? And then how do we get it the most appropriate outcome? And that could be euthanasia. You are all, I imagine, given who I know who's on the call and in this room, you're all doing this process, right? I'm just helping and giving you some tools to help the process along. Does that make sense? Okay, so step 1, to go in a little bit more detail, we want to do a home history, and we want to ask the right questions, whether it's a patron or whether it's the adopter. Sorry, that's the same thing. Whether it's the patron or whether it's the transfer partner, right? Whether it's an animal control officer, how did this dog respond out in the field? Whether it's like a hoarding case, how did you have to capture these animals? How long did it take you? And so in your packet, and honestly, this could be more exhaustive, but I have had other shelters look at this. I created it's called Home History Data Collection, and I've created like a massive 7-page document on questions I would want to know as a behavior professional, right? So when I'm with my clients and I'm asking them questions, I am like a detective. I'm just got my curiosity hat on, and I'm like, I need to ask a bunch of questions to really understand. And what is hard is because, you know, at time of intake, people's emotional, like they're stressed, they're concerned, they might not have access to details that we need. So sometimes we wind up calling them again to get more information, especially when we're confronted with something. However, some organizations are putting things like this online so that people can fill this out in the comfort of their home, like remove themselves from any perceived judgment or any perceived emotions that are happening because they are relinquishing their animal. And there's, I can't remember it now. There's an awesome database that East Coast Shelter is using that, like, if you answer yes, it prompts you to this. If you answer no, it prompts you to these questions, right? Because you'll notice on this document, there's general home history, and there's a ton of questions, like a ton of questions. And then from there, it prompts you to fill out other types of profiles. So if your answer to, does your dog have a history of escape? And they say yes. Okay, what does that mean? No clue what that means. So it prompts you to go to the escape profile, and there's a ton of other questions there for you to ask to understand why the dog is escaping, right? You might tell me your dog escapes and he did one time and it was like so scary for you that you were like, yeah, oh yeah, he totally escapes. Whereas like your dog might escape daily because he's like hopping over the fence to see the neighbor dog, right? So we really need to get the details and nitty gritty of what all these words mean. And asking, hi Megan. I don't know what that was. So it's important for us, and like I said, I had other shelters look at this, like San Diego Humane Society looked at this, and they have 40,000 animals a year. They like put DFL and HSPPR to shame with their number of animals. But I had other behavior professionals look at this. Do I think these questions could be tweaked? Do I think there could be more? 100%. But a lot of shelters that I work with don't have this at all. And so I was like, I'm going to put together all of the questions I would ask and then have it be a resource. Let's look at it in comparison to our intake process. How can we get as much information at that time as possible? How can we make it easier for the patron? How can we make it more efficient for us? Could they do it before they come in, right? I think it's really important, and I'm a strong advocate for calling patrons to gather more information at a later date. Because I have to tell you, and there is a stereotypic behavior profile in there. I added it specifically because of this case. We had a dog that was cleared medically, but we had a dog that we couldn't figure out what the trigger was. He would turn around, chase his tail, and he would bite his tail to the point of bleeding. And we thought it was like shelter stress. We're like, okay, so we got to get him a foster home. We could do pharmaceutical support to intervene. We need to get him cleared medically. We thought maybe he couldn't see. Like, there's all these stories we had about what was going on. And I called the patron, and they were like, oh yeah, he's been doing that since he's been a puppy. He does it several times a day. And I was like, wow. They were like, we just thought it was play. I was like, oh wow, it's really not a normal reaction, especially to the point of like self-injuring. And so we probably label that as a stereotypic behavior, meaning the behavior doesn't have a function and it happens repeatedly. And it's hard to interrupt. It was really hard to interrupt. He would actually if he was doing it to himself, if we tried to interrupt in some way, which we did so very carefully, he would then redirect and attempt to bite us. And so that particular case was so important to me to call the patron and gather more information, because we would not have known that was a dog that was like truly suffering in a variety of different ways, right? So calling and asking more information, I'm a huge fan of. Did Megan have something?
She's gonna do it.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, we already did this. One other thing I will say is that I did create, because I did a training for the Dumb Friends Leaks intake staff about separation related problem behavior. So that's separation anxiety. It's separation related problem behaviors is an umbrella term, and separation anxiety falls within that. And so I did a training because we added a profile. We added a bunch of questions for them, and it's actually right here. It's the second document. And I also then, on the back, explained why I am asking these questions from a behavior-specific standpoint. Why do I, as a behavior professional, want to know the answers to these questions? And so this could be a really just like ready-made document for you and your staff. If you decide to start to ask questions about separation-related problem behaviors, you'll see why I have all these questions in here. The dog is noise sensitive. If the dog is not social with other people or other dogs, it's going to be really hard to find a pet sitter, really hard to put that dog into daycare when you're doing a behavior modification program. The dog is more noise sensitive. It is that can really contribute and really impact in a negative way a lot of times your behavior modification protocol, because the dog is not just worried about you leaving the house, they also might be worried about perceived threats, which are noises happening outside the house. So there's a lot of questions on here, and then details as to why I'm asking those questions and why they're important for us to make decisions about the animals moving forward. Oh wait, hold on. Okay. The other thing I put together for you all, which this could be like a 2-day workshop, is just reading body language. So I put some resources on this document that I really like, that I share with my clients and I use often, that is really talking about body language in a really clear, concise way. I have been doing this for like 14 years now, and I learned about body language today, right? So I think and this is my profession, like I am solely focused on behavior, and I still learn all the time about canine body language. And I think it's really important that, our observations are made up of what we know and what we can actually see. So again, in conjunction to, having all these tools and having all these ways in which you're observing, if you're not really keen on body language, we are misinterpreting and miscommunicating with our canines in our care, right? So it's super important to be focused on, like, that is your number one goal, is how can I train my eye to get really, really good at what our dogs are communicating. And the best thing for me has been taking video and doing it frame by stinking frame, right? Where I've got the, what is that? Quick, whatever. What is it? Like, I open up a video. I'll just do that. Open up a video, and I do the space or the arrow button, and I go frame by frame. I don't even play the video. It is mind-blowing what you will see. It is mind-blowing what, in real time, all the stuff that we are missing. And I think that I have gotten better as observing behavior, because I am slowing it down so much. And then when I'm talking to my clients, I do the same thing. I have my clients take video or send me video, and then through Zoom, I share my screen and we do it frame by frame. And they're like, oh my gosh, mind blown, missed all of this. I haven't really figured out a better way to learn, because we've got all these filters, like I was talking about. We have all these learning histories, all these lenses that we bring into our experience with our dogs that we are projecting, because we're human beings, right? It's like no one's wrong. But I remember I did a dog-dog training where it's all about dog-dog communication at Dumb Friends like years ago. And this person was holding the leash in a way that was really tense and really tight when we were introducing this dog to other dogs. And I said to her, walk me through why you're tensing up on the leash. Like, what are you seeing that's making you want to do that? And she was like, oh, right before I left the building, somebody in adoptions told me this dog doesn't do well with other dogs. He was doing beautifully with the other dog, just even despite the leash tension. But so we all have these lenses that we are bringing into the situation. I think it's super important. Like, we owe it to our dogs to like video and check ourselves, right? Slow down the video and see like what I'm experiencing is that through my learning history, my lens, is that through my limited experience understanding body language, right? Or is that actually what's truly happening? And as a behavior consultant, I will say I have been wrong. And I think it's important for us to like know that that is a little bit of a blind spot. No pun intended or pun intended. That, you know, that is a blind spot for us. And I think it's super important that we learn what they're communicating. And then it's also really important to incorporate this into staff culture, right? So like with Rifle, we are talking about like, we're going to take a specific dog and we are going to take a video and then do it frame by frame and as a staff talk about it, like during, you know, weekly huddles or weekly meetings or something like that. So that it is really a topic of conversation in your organization. When we are talking about observations, like there is a ton of moments or antecedents that can cue us to start observing, right? Like we talked about it earlier. You know, what is the stray behavior? What's the intake observations? What happened during the behavior evaluation or the physical exam? What happened during the dog-dog test? What happened when they're on walks with volunteers, right? So there's a lot of different moments that we can observe dogs, so we don't have to put them in a room to do a behavior evaluation. We can be observing this entire time. And I think it's really important for us to pay attention to how we're talking about this. So if I were to say, like, actually, I'll just use that example with the dog-dog, is that if I hear that a dog doesn't do well with other dogs, so let's say the adoption counselor was like, that dog was really pushy with other dogs. What does that mean? Like, what does that look like? Your pushy might be different than my pushy. Is that actually true? Like, did that actually happen? Right? Was the dog pushy, or was the dog just offering a distance increasing behavior to make the other dog go away? Right? Because he was forced into the interaction. You know, I don't know. Right? So I think it's important that we're really clear about using labels that mean a whole slew of things to all of us. And here's the thing: we are not, and this is painful to watch, but in the dog training industry, we're like onto this. And trainers are trying to talk without a label. It's like so painful to watch. And you're like, you're a human being. You're gonna use a label. Just define it, right? So it would be totally appropriate if I was like, yeah, like he was really pushy when he interacted with that dog. By that I mean, right? By that I mean he, you know, walked into the situation, his tail was really high, his body was moving really quickly, his body weight was forward, he put his head on top of the other dog's back, right? Like, I'm describing what I saw. There's no way you're not going to use a label. It's just like, it's just impossible, right? So as long as we define it, super appropriate. So these are just some labels that we use, like where we say the dog seemed fine. Fine is it's such a funny word because everybody says it. Pet parents say he was fine, and then you put the kid in the face. It's like, okay, clearly he wasn't fine, right? And if anybody is having a fine day, like if I'm like, how are you, Lacey? You're like, fine. That's not really good, right? Like you're not like, oh, he was doing great, and then he lunged at the other dog. It's always like he was doing fine, meaning like AKA tolerating the situation, or not reacting, quote unquote, as we would deem poorly, right? He didn't escalate until he escalated, right? So these are the words that we want to really be clear that we are defining what we mean by them. I also think it's important that when we are capturing notes about an animal, right? So we're figuring out here's the home history, here's all the observations, and then now I've got to put this information into Chameleon or into some sort of system, or I'm relaying it to somebody else. I want to be sure that my labels are really clearly defined, and I could also, this is just a suggestion, write my notes in an ABC format, because that's what happened, right? So an example of that would be, you know, here's the more subjective thing. Like, he attempted to bite. Well, I don't know. What does that mean? Did he miss? Like, did you have a talk with him and his attempts were not fruitful, right? So attempted to bite, which is something that we use all the time. If we were to write this in a very clear way, the antecedent would be, I leaned over the dog's back with the microchip scanner in hand. My face was close to his face. That was the conditions that the behavior took place. Super important for us to have that information, because then we can understand what triggers this dog to react in a certain way. Behavior is dog froze, lifted his lip, and snapped. That's what we know. We don't know if he attempted to bite, and again, his attempts were, they failed, right? The consequences, I moved away from the dog. Those are all facts that clearly indicate a situation. So you can write your notes in an ABC format so that, again, we understand what triggered the dog to behave in a certain way, and then what was the consequence for that. And you're in a loop with your dog all the time, right? So I do a behavior, dog does a behavior, then I do a behavior, the dog does a behavior. We're in a behavioral loop. So it's important for us to put what was our behavior, what was the dog's behavior. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. Okay, oh great. What time is it? Perfect. We're gonna take a break. Does that feel good to everyone? Okay. So I see the glaze. It's happening. It's 11:47, so let's come back just to make it easy at noon. Do that. But yeah, that's a good point. So one thing I was saying before folks came back, are we at noon?
Yes.
Okay, is that if I go back to this allowed all handling. So at one point when I was giving this training forever ago at Dumb Friends League, I think it was like the beginning of COVID, so I remember wearing a mask. And we were talking as an ops team, like, okay, Marissa, this is really cool to write all these notes, but like it takes 2 seconds to write allowed all handling, and it takes a lot more time to write these notes, right? And we had talked about potentially creating like a shorthand, like using attempted to bite or allowed all handling, or I don't know, like I can't think of any other operations like shorthand terms that we all seem to use, and defining them. So like allowed all handling looks like this, and you will only use allowed all handling when it looks like this. So does that make sense? So it's you can define it in your notes, but if you as an organization had a glossary that allowed all handling always looks like this, then that's that's the shorthand that we use. We never wound up doing that at Dumb Friends League. I forget why. But yeah, so that's just an idea that if you want to come up with shorthand for your specific organization, you absolutely can. And there is, when we get to the risk assessment tool, which we're going to do next, there is a glossary in the back, because what affiliative signals mean to you might mean something very different on this risk scale, right? So you can definitely create a glossary. Okay. So a little bit of backstory about the risk assessment tool. So probably, oh wait, well this is Monty. I can't wait for you to talk about it. So this is the risk assessment tool. This has been through like hundreds of iterations. This is a tool that my colleague Lisa Mullinax, she was the behavior manager after me at Dumb Friends League. She and I co-created this. And this is the most recent version, and we are using this as a tool at Dumb Friends League. Valley Humane League helped me co-create this. Colorado Animal Rescue helped me co-create this. I believe another shelter piloted that I cannot remember. And so this tool is ready for you to use currently. What is also happening is I'm on a committee for the IAABC, it's the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, their shelter division. We have taken this and basically injected it with steroids, and it's going to be coming out really soon. Not really soon, probably in the beginning of next year. And it comes with a full manual. So all the stuff I'm teaching you about, it's got like a 30-page document to support it. We sifted through tons of research to make sure that everything that we were saying was supported by research. And it's the same sort of layout as this, but the words are slightly different. There's a different glossary, but it's the same essence. We're taking a look at behaviors in relation to risk and in relation to management. Just want to let you know that that tool is going to be coming out. We're going to be launching that nationally. But this is totally available and ready to go, and something that we're using at DFL that you can be using in your own shelters. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty of the risk scale, let's meet somebody really cute. So this is Monty. Love this dog. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of home history about this dog. So he was owner surrender. They couldn't afford to keep him. There was no other information that was stored about this dog. And why that is the case is because there were several staff and board turnovers during the time that this dog lived at the shelter for 2 years. He was adopted a day before his 2nd year anniversary. They weren't collecting and storing information at the time. If they did, it's in some filed piece of paper somewhere at some point that like we didn't have access to when I was meeting this dog. And so all we knew is that he's owner surrender, couldn't afford to keep, no information, lived at the shelter for 2 years. We also knew that he coexisted with female dogs in the yards. And we also knew that he had challenging interactions with one male, and I'll get to all the details, but a challenging interaction with one male on site at the shelter. We don't know any information about whether he lived with dogs or kids, or like we don't know anything about his home history. We observed kennel reactivity, meaning he was barking and lunging, sometimes closing distance, sometimes moving away. When greeting adopters, so adopters, if anyone's been to Kenora, it is indoor-outdoor kennels, and there are a bunch of kennels that open up into a big yard. So dogs would be moving about in the yard and like stressing all the other dogs inside their kennels. So they're like the kennel reactivity at that shelter is just like super fun and really intense. And so any dog would develop reactivity in general. So what they were doing is they were having people walk through and greet the dog at the kennel, and the reactivity was just insane. It was a recipe for disaster. No one was interested in him. They just continued to pass along, and he didn't have any specific medical concerns when I met him. We did find out later, and I'll talk about it in his home history, that he was scooting a lot. And we found that out when the dog got into a home, but no obvious medical concerns for this dog. So we've got like really little information about who this dog is in a home setting. We have some information about who this dog is in this really poor environment where reactivity is like meant to, it's just like a breeding ground. So how you use this risk scale. So okay, so what I want you to do is find risk scale human interactions. That's what this is right here. So given what we know about Monty, he reacts differently to humans in different conditions, right? So with people he knows, he would do consistent, hold on, let me take a step back. These scales, sorry, I'm like acting as if you have seen this and you know this. These scales go from low risk behaviors to high risk behaviors. Okay, so there's 1 through 6. All of these things are defined in the glossary, right? There is how we came up with these behaviors is that if an animal was consistently close to you, and we define proximity, and was consistently offering you affiliative social behaviors, that's low risk, right? If the dog had a level 3 bite or higher, and we have the bite scale in here, that's higher risk behavior, right? So we tried to take a look at all of these specific behaviors and we laid them out in a risk format. What is low, what is high? And that doesn't mean that if you engage in a behavior that is on the high risk scale, that you're immediately, not qualified for adoption, because as you'll see, sometimes his behavior is a little bit more risky because of the conditions, and sometimes behavior is not. Some choices he makes are really great, and some choices he has a hard time with, right? And so to say that the dog is aggressive or fearful or whatever label we decide, it doesn't encapsulate the entirety of this dog, right? So we're going to go through his human interactions at the shelters. That's all we have. And I'm going to show you how they're different. Based off of the condition, his behavior gets risky or less risky. Does that make sense? Questions? Yeah.
How old is he?
Oh, thank you. He is, at that time, he was 3, we were guessing. He is now like 4.5. Yeah, good question. Okay. Neutered male. Gosh, why didn't I add this in? Neutered male was neutered on site at their shelter like a few months prior to me meeting him. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what shelter is this?
Kenora Animal Shelter in Monte Vista, Southern Colorado.
So it's not
Yeah, they are socially conscious. They identify as socially conscious now. But yes, they are. I would say that in the past they have considered themselves no-kill. And yeah, he is a dog that I'm like, I mean, you'll see. When I met him, I was like, oh, there's so much potential for this dog. Like, he just needs a different environment. He needs like some interventions he needs to get out of this facility. So this is not a dog that I would have been like, we need to make a euthanasia decision. There were definitely other dogs that have been living there for long periods of time that I was like, this dog is quite dangerous. And they were open to talking about that and having that conversation, which I think is really quite incredible. So yeah, good question. Any other questions about Monty? Okay. So with people he knew, which was like 4 staff members and maybe some board of directors that would come in, he exhibited consistent proximity with affiliation. So he would approach and be consistently near you with soft, loose, relaxed body postures. He would solicit engagement. He would offer affiliative signals, behaviors that demonstrate the dog is seeking attention or affection of a human or other animal, usually coupled with, again, relaxed body postures. And he would be standing parallel. So the reason why we put parallel versus perpendicular is because you know those dogs that sort of like as you're moving, they're remaining frontal with you, like they do not want to keep their eyes off of you. The dog is standing parallel or even has their sort of back to you. It's a little bit more vulnerable position. And so we wanted to be able to capture that in this. So he's leaning in, affiliation, right? And again, especially with people that he knows. With new people out of the kennel, this is why this is, this is a totally different condition, right? New people out of the kennel, and this was with people he didn't know. He would offer some brief proximity with conflicted behavior, so he might approach an air scent and then he'd avoid. He would sometimes just walk around and completely avoid. Sometimes he would offer displacement behaviors, which are coping behaviors like lip licking, yawning, scratching, shaking off. He would sometimes make sure that he was perpendicular to you. He might just be sniffing the ground to avoid you, but he was sort of keeping an eye on wherever you were. Sometimes he didn't approach at all. Some people he would recover, and there would be, like specifically females, he would approach sometimes, and sometimes, with males, he sort of arced around them and didn't approach. And depending on the situation, he might do a mild threat display, and how we're defining that, hold on, is super low effort, so like a lip lift or a growl, right? In comparison to like barking and lunging and closing distance, right? So with people out of the kennel, depending on what they were doing, it was like, hey, you're gonna sit in a chair and not necessarily approach me. I'm super cool, just coexisting with you. Oh wait, now this guy is standing up. I might do a little low growl, but he never closed distance, right? So see how his behavior is very different based off of the conditions. Yeah. Question. Gender biased, Miguel said. I guess so. I'm not. He's basically saying like, is he biased to women versus male? So with new people out of the kennel, this is how he reacted. It's riskier than the affiliation that we're seeing over here because he's tolerated. This is the whole like he seemed fine thing, right? Sort of like, yeah, I see you, you're there, okay, you're gonna do this on the floor. Like, oh wait, what are you gonna do now? Like, okay, you're still safe, okay, right? So it's a dog that's conflicted and uncomfortable. Right, and so it's a little bit riskier depending on what people decide to do with their body. If people decide to approach him, right? Like, if he's already starting from a place of conflict, he might escalate, especially if he's offering some avoidance behaviors, right? And then somebody doesn't read that appropriately and they approach. That's when dogs could or have the possibility or the potential to escalate, right? Because they're like, hey, I said I didn't want a social interaction. I don't want the social interaction, and now you're continuing to close distance, right? So with new people approaching his kennel, like I mentioned, persistent mild threat displays. So persistent meaning low growling the whole time. It's persistent. Versus before there might be a growl with recovery, meaning he growled and then he maybe walked away and did a shake off or something like that. So he's persistent, mild threat display, he maintains distance, or sometimes he was decreasing distance with an active threat display. So those are riskier behaviors. Those behaviors, notice everything is different based off of the conditions. And they're totally different points of day, right? Like he might react, let's say he reacts, he chooses behaviors in level 3 and 4 in the morning when somebody approaches because he's not stressed, he's not so stressed throughout the day. But let's say everybody's reactive in the kennel and his poor little nervous system is getting jacked throughout the day, and then somebody approaches his kennel, and maybe this is the 4th person that's approached his kennel, that's when he starts to engage in behaviors like the level 5 or 6 category. So all of those conditions are really important for us to know why the behavior is happening. And we want to always look at this scale. This is the bite scale. And this is just adapted from Ian Dunbar's bite scale. We sort of removed the depth at which the puncture wounds happen because nobody is measuring depth of puncture wounds. And so we sort of edited that, but it is pretty much the Ian Dunbar bite scale. The new bite scale that is going to be coming out in the new tool, it has all this medical terminology, and we're hoping that we can really work with hospital professionals. We asked that for their input so we could be speaking the same language about dog bites. So that bite scale is going to look really different. But this is what everyone is probably really used to. And we're always looking at behavior in relation to management. How can we manage this behavior from escalating? How can we prevent it from escalating? Because behavior doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? So when I think about managing his behavior in the shelter or managing his behavior, we're going to talk about managing his behavior in the home. There's low management, moderate management, and high management. And his behaviors fall into the moderate category. So they're defensive behaviors, meaning like he is reacting to his environment. There's multiple triggers. It's not just a man with a hat and sunglasses. It's kind of all men. It's some women. It's in a variety of different types of conditions. So we've got more to manage, more to deal with. But we can predict and prevent with education. This is where I was like, oh wow, we're introducing these adopters at the kennel door. Like hard, like who wants to adopt a dog that's barking at, at the kennel door? No one does, right? So we can absolutely pinpoint when it's happening, why it's happening, and we can prevent with education and really mild interventions, which is what we did, which I will show you. Does that make sense? We're always looking at the behavior, so that's the risk scale. How is the animal behaving towards another human? How is the animal behaving towards other animals? We'll do that next. In conjunction to how are we going to manage that response, right? Because that's really important as a behavior professional. We're sort of weighing all of this, like, wow, we've got a dog that's reacting. We have no place to safely house them. They're self-mutilating. This is a really hard thing to manage in our shelter environment, right? We're always thinking about that. So I have this other document here. It's called the Canine Summary, where you can start to put in your risk levels. So depending on the scenario, this dog is could be social, conflicted, or confrontational. Those are labels, right? And so the behaviors are listed in the human risk scale. Depending on the scenario, he can score between, or for lack of a better word, he can score, his behaviors are 1 through 6, right? Again, depending on the conditions. This is why I think the old school 15-minute behavior assessment, it doesn't give us the full picture, right? It doesn't tell us how this dog responds in life. And so his management level is moderate, right? So we've got low risk behaviors, moderate and high risk behaviors. And it's a moderate ask to manage this dog, right? Okay. Home history, human interactions, there's none to report, so I don't have like a scale, right? So now let's talk about his interactions with other animals. What is going to be cool about the tool that's coming out next year is that we have a domestic animal scale and we have a conspecific scale. So how dogs respond to dogs, so within the same species. And then we have a domestic animal scale. So how animals are responding to cats, livestock, things of that nature. They're similar scales, but there are some differences to pull out, like if there's some sort of predatory behaviors that we're observing as well. So that's going to be exciting to the new risk scale. So for right now, we just have the animal risk scale. So I told you that he coexisted with females in the shelter yard. This was information I was gathering from the staff when I went to visit, and I'll talk about my visit. And I'm sort of guessing what happened based off of what I know about this dog and based off of the limited information that was shared with me. But I didn't observe any of this. I was told this. So some avoidance, lack of interaction with relaxed body language, some displacement behavior, and some mild threat displays. They told me that when he got nose to nose with some of them, he would just do a low growl and recover pretty quickly. So he would just sort of coexist with these females in the yard, right? He's barking at other dogs from inside the kennel, oh, I'm sorry. That was the mild threat display. I'm sorry. He coexists with females in the shelter yard, tons of avoidance and displacement behaviors. barking at the dogs from inside the kennel, that was when he did the mild threat display. So that's when he was barking. He didn't sit in the kennel from my observations and just bark at dogs in the other yard that was adjacent to his kennel, meaning they could actually come up to his kennel nose to nose through chain link fence. I think he just got so habituated or used to that environment that, and his kennel was like maybe this large, that he would go to the back and just like, sometimes he'd bark at them and other times it like, okay, dogs are moving around, right? So there was a little bit of resilience there. And then this is the reported poor interaction with another male. So they had another male that came out, rushed him nose to nose, they both froze, and then the other male snapped at him, and then he actually did a level 2 bite and actually did a puncture wound in that dog's ear. But it was, I mean, for lack of a better word, like provoked. The dog rushed him, they froze. I think that dog then snapped, and then he made contact, right? Superficial, single puncture, like barely needed medical. They just treated it on site. So here's the bite scale. We always want to look there. So the management scale here, again, we have some defensive behaviors. We have multiple triggers. We now have a new one, which is risk of minor injury if management fails, right? And minor injury, we go back to our bite scale, level 2, and this is what we're defining as a significant injury, okay? So when we think about if management fails, if somebody drops a leash or somebody puts him with another male dog, there's a risk it could happen. Might not. If the other male dog decides like, whoa, you are really stiff and staring at me and I would prefer not to approach you, I'm gonna walk around this way and avoid you, it might not happen. But when the conditions are just right, if another dog approaches and really rushes, like he was rushed, it wasn't just an approach, the risk of minor injury is there, right? Because it has already happened. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So we can fill in our canine summary. Depending on the scenario, he scores between a 1 and a 5, and his management requirements are moderate. Again, no home history with other animals, other like cats, dogs, nothing. We don't have anything. So all we're doing is going off of what is happening in the shelter. We also have a quality of life scale, and this is not, I mean, when we look at quality of life, we want to make sure that the animal we have in care is thriving, especially if they're in the shelter for 2 years, right? Like we want to make sure that like the dog's needs are being met as best as we can because it's a stressful environment. And what I would say when I looked at this dog's quality of life, like he was eating and drinking, engaging in play with people he knew. He was engaging with humans and dogs in low stress environments. So like when he was stressed out barking in the kennel, it was hard to get him to pay attention to you. But when we removed him from the kennel environment and brought him to a lower stress environment, he was able to engage with people. And we did that actually with me, and I'll share with you how I met him. But he wasn't engaging in like avoiding eating. He wasn't spinning in circles in his kennel, which is stereotypic behaviors. He wasn't, drooling all the time or like just not engaging in normal dog behavior. His quality of life ranged depending on the situation, depending on the day, between like thriving to a little bit of struggling, right? Which most of us can probably anticipate that, given how long he's been in the shelter. So all of the words, I tried to read some of them, but all of the words are defined in this glossary. So if you have a question about a word on any of those risk scales, it should like look at this glossary. So now I have to figure out what the heck to do with this dog. So he's low to high risk with humans in certain conditions. He's low to higher risk with dogs in certain conditions. It's kind of like all dogs. Like dogs are gonna, be riskier in certain situations depending on the situation. It is what it is, right? And so we need to figure out what we're going to do with this dog. And so this is when I came into their shelter. They had they had like 40 or so dogs there that really, we sort of took walked through their population and we sort of categorized them in like green dogs, go up for adoption, yellow dogs, which is Monty, you know, some behavior concerns, let's figure out a plan for him, and then red dogs, which were like, these are really high risk dogs. Are we willing to place these in the community, right? So we brought Monty out, and some of the questions that I ask when we're dealing with, you know, what is the flow for this animal? What are the options? Given the dog's size, what is the level of risk in relation to the behavior concern? This is not to be confused that small dogs that are exhibiting really poor quality of life and small dogs that are exhibiting threat displays and distance increasing behaviors in a variety of contexts, just because they're small doesn't mean that we should just place them, if that makes sense. There's a lot of small dogs that I think are really struggling in life and have a lot of triggers that set them up. And we place them because they're like, well, the damage that they can do is very different than the damage a Rottie could do, right? So I'm not saying that we euthanize those dogs. What I am saying, though, is that we should, like, size matters and it also doesn't at the same time, right? Like if a dog is really struggling and has a variety, like a small dog is escalating to biting every single time someone approaches or picks them up, that's really stressful for that small dog to live in a world where people are going to pick him up, right? It's just something to consider. This is not absolutes. These are questions that you and your team should be talking about, having discussions about each individual case. Age. Is this within a normal behavior response given the dog's current developmental stage? This one's important to me because I have seen some really scary puppies, like really scary puppies that I'm like, wow, that should not really be occurring at this stage in the game. I'm talking like 3 in my career that I'm like, this is really dangerous. And I placed one of them and regretted it. And I lived to tell the tale because I was working with the client. And I think it's just important for us to pay attention to that, right? Is this within the range of normal, whatever that is, for a puppy? Not necessarily, right? Or is this within, like, is this dog an adolescent and his needs are not being met and so therefore he's like reacting in the shelter? It's like, yeah, that's pretty normal, right? So it's just another, again, a talking point. What are the resources inside your community or inside your organization? What is your current shelter population? That's a huge question people have to ask. They just sort of take in animals and then they're like, oh my gosh, we have like 80% of our cases are behavior cases. Like my colleague works at Seattle Humane and 80% of the cases are like significant behavior concerns, right? Which takes a lot of time and resources. Do you have the resources to support the animal currently? Can you prevent or manage the problematic behavior? Do you have the resources to modify, right? And are there transfer opportunities available that can help with this? Questions about your community. Do you have behavior resources to help the adopter navigate the behavior concern? Newsflash, nobody really does. I just did a bunch of behavior coalition calls. Lacey was on the call, thank you, to really talk about where are we lacking in behavior in the shelter. And wow, we are just, it was like depressing to create the list because it's the challenges we are facing in Colorado for behavior specific cases is really, really, really great. And so, you know, do we have post-adoption support? It's not really a lot. Not really a lot. There's not a lot of affordable post-adoption support. I mean, you saw in the beginning of the presentation, 38% spent over $1,000 to modify your dog's behavior, right? Is there a history of adopting these current behavior issues? Is there a history of adopting complexity of behavior and medical? And then medical, are the behavior concerns that you're experiencing, will they be exacerbated or, you know, is it going to be hard to treat a medical concern because of the behavior? These are just questions that as a behavior professional, I'm taking a look at and saying, sitting down with my behavior team and going like, we have a case, here's Monty, what are we gonna do? The benefit of this risk tool and this placement considerations that we have learned through piloting it with other shelters is that this is a tool you can have conversations with other professionals with. So instead of me saying, Shelby, right? It's like, well, this is my experience with Monty. And you're like, well, this is my experience with Monty, right? And we just go back and forth with our little experiences. We can, as a team, look at the risk scale and talk about our experiences through the same lens. And what it has shown in some of the organizations that I've piloted it is that there's less conflict around these decisions, which is like makes my heart sing, because as someone who has had to make a ton of euthanasia decisions and perform it is so hard on all of us that we have to make these decisions. And so if this tool can be sort of a lens that you look cases through and talk about this through, that would be an added bonus. And that's what we have seen with organizations. Okay, so in relation to Monty, he's a 65-pound dog. They did not at the time, what? Oh, they didn't have resources at the time until we started the training. Lots of dogs with behavior concerns when I was there, like I had mentioned. And we got a ton of them out to rescue, like, just so you know. It was like a really amazing, like, we did euthanize some, but it was a really small number, and we got a ton out to rescue. It was awesome. There were limited resources due to behavior and breed. So it was a pity that made contact with another dog. Who here is transferring him? Nobody really, right? And the community continued to pass him up because it's like, he's really not taking this whole first date thing seriously, right? He's just like barking at the kennel door. Who wants to adopt? So when we look at all the information, step one, looking at through the lens of risk, step two, now we have to figure out, what are we doing with this dog? We're doing adoption, we're putting up for adoption, no restrictions, with some restrictions. Are we doing like a private training session before we get adopted? These are DFL choices, by the way. Are we doing transfer? What are we doing with this dog? We foster. What is the actual flow and outcome for this dog? And so what we decided to do was we left him up for adoptions with restrictions. No other dogs or kids under 14 in the home, to be conservative. And then we did slow introductions with adopters, and I showed them a brand new process, which you guys are going to see. The process was stop introducing him at the kennel door because it's just not setting him up for success. What we did is we wound up creating an enrichment space where if anybody met this dog or they were interested in him, he was brought out into their enrichment space. Everybody, there were chairs on the outskirts. He was seated there, or sorry, they were seated there. And the enrichment space had nose work boxes, it had licky mats, it had DIY enrichment, like egg cartons with treats inside, and it was just sort of like, okay, I'm gonna meet you, but I'm like gonna meet you while I'm engaging in something. We weren't distracting him. He knows people are there, right? If he's conflicted and concerned, he knows they're there. But we were trying to create a positive space where he can come in, engage in species typical enrichment. The people were seated with something to do, right? We told them to ignore the dog and wait for him to approach. They were not threatening. And if he wound up approaching, we would keep him on leash, keep it slacked. If he approached someone, we would mark that, we would say yes, and then we would reinforce him with a high value treat away, right? So we were marking and reinforcing his choice to go up. Any point he wanted to walk away, he absolutely could. Just a really hands-off approach of greeting people. And we were to keep the interactions really short. We practiced this process with people he knew first. This is the sequence. We're gonna go to the kennel, we're gonna go to the enrichment space, which was like a picnic table. I mean, they don't really have much. Like it was just like, it wasn't even a room, it was outside. And he'd be like, oh yeah, it's so fun. I'm gonna do licky mats, I'm gonna do all these things. Oh, there's a person there. I'm gonna get clicked and treated for looking at the person. oh, I go over and air sent them. I'm gonna get clicked and treated for that. This is so fun. Nobody's stepping on my, like encroaching in my boundary. I kind of like you, right? And then he would warm up super quick. So we did this process with me first to introduce him, and he warmed up to me within like a minute. We did this process then with a bunch of volunteers. We kept it internally first. Volunteers he knew, and then volunteers he didn't know, before we released this to the masses, right? So we did these adoption setups to get him. And guys, this was like, I don't know, maybe they did this like once every other day for like 15 minutes, and they did this a handful of times before we started with actual people that were interested in adopting him. So this is what, I'm gonna play this video later because this is actually him in his home. But this is what it looks like. We've got like the egg carton, the nose work boxes. I mean, like any shelter can do this. We did, like I brought down the enrichment items like licky mats and food puzzles, but you just think of like cardboard, anything, right? Putting treats inside stuff. So this is what the enrichment space looked like, and then people would sit around it on the like backs up against the wall so that the dog has plenty of space. This is nose work. So does anyone want to, do you guys, this is like a 6-minute video. Do you want to, are people familiar with nose work? Okay, I'm going to play it because this is how I introduced this, and we used.
Hey everyone, I'm going to show you how I do nose work for my clients. So I have a bunch of boxes. They're of all different shapes and sizes. And you want to be really careful as to whether or not a box like this is too deep for either a small dog or a dog that's fearful. And if that's the case, and that's the only box that you have, you could potentially lean it on its side like this. But the whole idea is to spread the boxes in a small search area to start. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like. And then you're going to place a really stinky, high-value treat inside each box. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Got a bunch of boxes. I want to make sure that every single box has it so that the dog gets access to the reinforcer inside every box. So we're basically communicating boxes predict really good yummies. And I'm setting them up close together so that the dog can just get a reinforcer, see another box, get a reinforcer, see another box. And it's at this point, your dog might be visually seeing the boxes, and that becomes the cue. But at some point, we make this a little bit harder. They start to drop in and use their nose. Some dogs might use their nose right away, while other dogs are visually seeing the boxes, and that's totally fine. So we've got Tucker waiting in the wings. So I'm going to stand up. Go ahead.
This is not Monty.
I'm not really going to engage with him. I don't want him to engage with me. I want him to drop into his environment and do what he's born to do. Use that stinking nose. And if I walk around, it's to reload boxes. And if he sees me reloading, it's fine. I could do it like secretively by just tossing really lightly. That is like the top of a fish head with the eye. It's so creepy. So what you can't see that's happening out of frame is that Tucker is engaged with a box, and he wound up knocking it over with his nose, and now he's really using his nose and not necessarily his eyesight. So he went back to a box where he was successful using his nose, drop back in. That is a narrow, tall box. And so that could be really scary to put your whole head inside something like that. So I'm just gonna, whoop. So one of them landed outside of the box, which, whoop, he got it. So So notice I'm not really engaging with him. I'm not cueing him to do anything. If he were to look up to me for information, I really just want to be here and be somewhat boring so that again he drops into something that has more value. And I think you can see he's using his nose right now.
Okay, for the sake of time, that video, I can send the links to all these videos. So I cannot say a million things about nose work. Nose work, I think, is the greatest thing ever because all dogs, it's going to meet any dog's need because it's a species typical enrichment activity. We used to do this when I was behavior manager. We had a nose work program for dogs that were like high energy or high arousal, meaning they, were like couldn't focus during training sessions. And we would come downstairs, be super hands off with them, especially dogs with like previous like history of using their mouths on people. We would drop the leash in our training space and just let them do nose work. And it was a way to help them like connect with their environment, drop in, be a dog, do an enriching activity before we even took them for a walk or attempted to do any learning activity. It's the cheapest form of enrichment because all you need is boxes and every shelter has a box, right? It's the easiest thing to teach volunteers. You kind of can't really screw it up. No one's doing nose work competitively, right? And what we tried to utilize is the reason why I use it in my private practice a ton. The reason why I use it is because if a dog is concerned about their environment and they show up into that environment in that way, they're hypervigilant or whatever behaviors they're always doing, nose work is the greatest way to be like, yeah, here's that same environment, but here's a really cool thing that you're naturally born to do. Right? So you have to teach it in a low distracting environment first, and then you sort of gradually, fade it into a harder environment. But for shelter dogs, we've just like set it up in a yard or something, or like in a room or wherever, and it's been really successful. It's good for shy dogs. It's good for reactive dogs. It's good for all dogs. Like I again cannot say enough amazing things about it. And Monty, we use this in his life at home as well. Here are some of the other enrichment items that we set up. And then the staff was like, okay, he's doing really well. We tried it with a new person. I think we got to make him ready for adoption. We're like, okay, great. This was in August. I met this. Can you just, with the space, I can. Just love this dog so much. So met him in August. We did the plan. In November, this amazing woman, Casey Widerich, I think that's how you pronounce her last name. She's from Relay for Rescue up north. She heard about this and decided to do, I'm going to sleep in this shelter until this dog is adopted. This woman and this dog made People magazine. Okay. And in walks Josh. A guy adopts him. Remember, he's a little bit concerned about men. This guy, so Josh, such an amazing guy, was traveling down south, saw this in the news or on Facebook or something, and was like, oh my gosh, I'm near the shelter. I'm going to drive through and go meet this dog. They did the whole process, and it was so heartwarming. As a behavior professional, he told me how they set up the whole process, and they did everything to the T, and like the dog warmed up to him really, really quickly, and I was like, yeah, I'm so proud of them that they were doing this, right? They were actually doing the protocol, and I think she slept in the shelter. I feel like it was like 10 days or like 8 days or something. It was a short period of time. Josh came in, brought Monty home. Like, amazing story, right? Oh wait, do we want a break? Yeah, everyone's great. Okay, so amazing story, and then we're gonna move into Monty's life in Boulder. I'm just gonna, no, I'm kidding. Okay, so before we go into what we did with Monty. I just want to talk a little bit about behavior modification frameworks, like what I'm using in my practice, what I'm leaning on. And so I had talked to you before about this already. So this is not Marissa Martino's dog training philosophy. This is applied behavior analysis, right? So this is ABA. It's pulled from humans and it's used with dogs, right? And so, and many animals, to be honest. And so we're looking at antecedents, behavior, consequences. How do we change behaviors? How do we change antecedents? How do we change consequences, right? Like those are the things that we can change and modify in order to get the behavior that we're looking for. I'm also using Dr. Susan Friedman's humane hierarchy. And when I am working with a dog or a human, I am looking at the experience and how I'm teaching things through a lens of LIMA. It's called least intrusive, minimally aversive. So least intrusive means I am not pushing the person or pushing the dog to do a different behavior. I'm trying to cultivate experiences so that behavior emerges. Least intrusive, minimally aversive, I am staying very far away from using punishment as the consequence to get the things that I want, right? So that's the acronym that we use in behavior consulting. This sort of like a highway where we start up here, we go down here. These are all scientific terms and things that we're not really going to go into right now because this is not a learning theory class. But we are always taking a look at the dog's or the animal or the person's wellness first, right? What does their environment consist of, both externally and internally? Are they in pain? Are they experiencing, are they suffering from a medical concern? What is their enrichment like? I had already alluded earlier, right, that like if a dog is not receiving, not getting their needs met, behavior, if you saw one behavior problem, we see it pop up, we see a different one pop up over here. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of that animal from nutritional, emotional, social, like what are all their needs and are they being met, right? It's like, what is it? Maslow's, what's that? Maslow, yeah, hierarchy of needs it's for humans, right? Isn't it, right? And so I have 2 dogs in my practice right now that have extreme environmental allergies. One is, sorry, not environmental, one is food and one is environmental. That doesn't mean their behavior, like that we're going to solve their allergies to grass and their allergies to food and all the behavior that they have been exhibiting and rehearsing for long periods of time doesn't go away. But it is a contributing factor. These dogs don't feel well every single day. Like we did a nose work game in the yard. Poor dog was like itchy in his nose. Like, it's like, okay, well that's our answer, right? That like grass is clearly an allergen, right? So we're taking a look at all of those things before we even start behavior modification. And we're also arranging the environment. So antecedent arrangement is just a fancy way of saying like we are modifying the environment so that we get the behaviors that we want so we can start to reinforce the things that we want, right? And then we're going to start to positively reinforce or teach the dog something new. Teach them, hey, instead of barking and lunging, I need you to watch the dog walk by and check in with me, right? And we don't do that when you're losing your mind because nobody can learn or function when they're losing their mind. We're working under threshold always, right? And I'm going to show you what we did with Monty. So this is another framework. Another framework that I think is really interesting that is got a lot of hype right now is Kim Brophy. So she is, she studies ethology and she's got a really great book out there called Meet Your Dog. It's new. Why I like her framework is because it's taking a look at the dog through the lens of, okay, what's their learning history? Have they learned that barking and lunging makes scary things go away? They have. Great. What's their environment look like, right? So that's antecedent arrangement. What does those genetics say? It's like we've gone so far and been like every dog is individual, but then we like forget that like there are breeds. There are like breed specific tendencies that are causing some of these behaviors to happen. Like, I mean, if I get one more call from a cattle dog or a border collie client that's like, he's chasing cars, it's like, well, yeah, right? Like, of course he is. And it's not that we want to look at that animal through that breed lens, just that breed lens, right? Because not all border collies do that. I worked with a 5-month-old yesterday that like could care less about cars moving by, but like other people and other dogs, very concerned and became hypervigilant, right? So it's important to be aware as best we can about the dog's genetics, and the best way we can do that, I mean, we're not going to do that testing in shelters, but when I'm working with a client, we're taking a look at all these things. And then lastly, I really love that she talks about who is this dog, right? So, you know, my dog says that he's 50% lab, 25% Pyrenees, and 25% we don't know. That dog really does. I don't see a ton of lab tendencies in him at all, even though that's the majority of his genetics. So it's important for us to take a look at all of these things. It's not just counter surfing, barking and lunging, right? It's not that. It is all these things when we are trying to modify behavior in a holistic way. The last thing I want to say that I didn't have up here is Sarah Stremming. If anyone doesn't know, Sarah Stremming has an amazing podcast called Cog Dog, one of my dear friends, and she has her 4 steps to behavioral wellness, which is basically nutrition, huge, enrichment. So we talked a lot about that. She's the woman that coined decompression walks. So taking dogs basically out of their environment on long lines, out in nature, let them be a dog. Just that sometimes can be modifying enough. So there's enrichment, nutrition, how you're communicating with the dog, and then physical activity. So now that you know sort of where I see the world through, what lens I am looking at Monty through, these are the behavior concerns in the home. This is what I think is really important, because I didn't think he was really that, he got more challenging in the home. So I think that's really important for us as shelter professionals to not just go, all he needs is love and all he needs is to get out of the shelter, because he got out of the shelter and we had some problems, right? And so I think that's really important to say, and that doesn't mean that we make the assumption that, oh, he's gonna have problems. I'm just saying that's not necessarily true, the whole all we need is love bit. What we observed in the first few weeks was barking and lunging at bikes, cars, people, and dogs. It's like, well, duh. He lived in a shelter for 2 years, barking and lunging at a lot of stuff, right? Wasn't exposed to cars unless they pulled up in the parking lot, but he wasn't exposed to like, in the last 2 years, a car was like driving by. They didn't walk him near cars that were moving. Lots of pulling on walks. And my client at the time was like, I really want to train him to walk near me. And I'm like, yeah, he's pulling because he's stressed, right? It's not that like he was just pulling because he's like super pumped because we're headed to this direction and I'd love to chase the squirrels when we get there. He was like frenetically pacing from side to side. We had some house training concerns. He would not poop in the backyard. This was a really big problem for us because we have a really reactive dog that now we have to walk in the neighborhood that is pretty busy, and he won't poop in the backyard. And I'll talk a little bit about what we had to do. And then he had several poor meet and greets. This started happening, like I would say, a month into the situation. So he's a little bit more comfortable in the house. He adopted him during COVID. I mean, COVID's still happening, but he's adopted him in like the heart of when no one was really coming over. And then he was starting to expand his world ever so slightly, the cleaning lady. And I'll go through each of these situations. And one of them resulted in a level 2 bite. So meet this dog. First things first, we have to figure out how are we gonna get this dog's needs met. We can't take him for a walk because of his reactivity, but we have to take him for a walk because he's not pooping in the backyard, like would hold it like a day and a half. So we were like, okay, how are we gonna balance all of these competing things, right? So we wanted to first say, is there anything medical contributing to this dog's behavior? He had a full vet exam. We thought, I mean, he was scooting a bunch in the backyard. We thought maybe he needed his anal glands expressed. That was not the case. We thought maybe there was like a food allergy going on, like maybe that's why he was scooting. Like we really couldn't get to the bottom of this. And to be honest, it actually has decreased. And we never really truly found out like why he was doing that. I don't know if it was a food allergy and he was just, and it took a while to transition him, but I thought maybe that was contributing to why he wasn't pooping in the backyard. We were really guessing at this point. But there was nothing really clear that was like, oh, this is why, like he's not in pain, he's not, he doesn't have like chronic ear infections or he's not scratching or any of that. Oh, sorry. So then we want to ask the dog, is the dog getting enough exercise and mental stimulation, right? So we're looking at that hierarchy. What we decided to do is we decided to utilize his backyard as the majority of the place where he would get all of his enrichment. So we had nose work, we had frozen topples, we had frozen licky mats, we would play tug with him back there. Like pretty much if he was getting enrichment, it was out in that backyard. It was really big. You'll see a video of it. And we were really only doing these short neighborhood walks just for potty breaks, because if we stepped out of the house, super hypervigilant, barely could eat, and was barking and lunging, and the streets within this neighborhood were really small. So Josh really couldn't get a lot of space away from triggers. There's bikes. I mean, it was a pretty busy part of Boulder. That wasn't the place he could learn. It's too overstimulated. And so we made sure, and luckily, thank you, Monty, for being like kind of a lazy hippo pitty. Like he didn't really require a ton. Like if this was like an adolescent border collie, we would have really had to get creative. But he didn't really need a ton in terms of enrichment. We made sure that we did all of that in the backyard. What is the management plan? When we're talking about changing the environment, the question I'm asking is, what is the management plan in place while you train the behavior? Training behavior modification takes time, so you need a management plan always. And you might actually, like, he has management strategies that he uses all the time. It's not that like they go away. So you manage the behavior, prevent it from rehearsing and getting worse while we're teaching the dog new behaviors, and we're making those more desirable to engage in. And we're doing that under threshold, which again is hard, right? Like I'm telling this poor guy, he's like, I'm so pumped, just got this dog, we go for walks, have him go to the brewery, all the things, and I'm like, yeah, like that's not the thing, what we're gonna be doing with this dog. And he was so great. What did I mean? Like a lot of my clients are really willing to make these modifications, but he had to make quite a few. And I think if this wasn't during COVID, it would be hard for anyone, really. Like we really could not greet other people with dogs. So the other question I'm going to ask is for what do I want the dog to do instead? So in my, hold on, I'm going to show you a video. And then how do I generalize this behavior from in the living room to in the backyard to in the front of the house to on walks, right? Dogs don't have the capability of just going, oh my gosh, thanks for teaching me like that behavior in the living room. Like I so get it in every context, no matter what situation. They don't, right? They generalize the things that we don't want them to. Man in hat equals all men in hat are scary, right? But they don't generalize the skills that we want them to. So we have to work under threshold. And the new behavior that I do with my clients when I'm working with reactivity is I allow the dog to check out the scary thing. And when the dog disengages, and I'll show you a video, I mark and reinforce that. I always want a reactive dog at a distance that they can handle to be able to see the thing and make the choice on their own to go, not a big deal. Click and treat, right? I don't need them to check in with me. I get that as a byproduct, but I want them to make the choice, and this is very hard in the shelter, so I'm not saying that anyone does this in the shelter, because we can't control the environment like we were talking about during the break. I am marking and reinforcing a coping behavior of disengagement. I see the scary thing and I make a decision that it's not going to kill me and I do something different, right? So that's what I'm looking for when I'm working with reactive dogs. If the dog is like, no, I see the thing and it's coming and it's scaring me and I'm starting to fixate and escalate, right? That's when I will play find it and I will say that, and then I will toss treats and create distance away because the dog's having a hard time. I need to help him. Whereas in the other situation where I'm playing the engage, disengage game, he can do it on his own, right? So we'll see videos of that. I also have to have, I would say that like 80% of dog training and behavior consulting is consulting for the human. Working on their internal thoughts about their dog, how those internal thoughts impact how they show up, impacts their behavior, and then impacts their dog's behavior. So we had to have a lot of conversations about like, what is realistic for this dog? Like, is this dog ever going to go to the dog park, and does he want to? Like, if I were to interview Monty, he'd be like, yeah, no thanks. I might hang out with like one or two of those dudes, but like, that's it, right? And so having these conversations with Josh and being like, okay, we need to reframe some of your expectations. We can work towards this thing without being grippy about it, which I think is really hard for a lot of us, right? It's like the Buddhist quote, not too tight, not too loose. It's like we want to work towards something, but we got to go at the pace of the dog. Teaches people patience and humility real fast. So I already talked a little bit about this, like what we decided to do for the leash reactivity. So we increased the enrichment. We also worked on, what was lovely about Boulder is that there are some locations that I do with my reactive dog clients where I'll say, we're going to meet at the dog park, but we're going to park 100 feet away, 200 feet away. And the beauty about that is that when people arrive to the dog park, they park their car, they're going to the dog park. We know where they're going. So we can work so far away on all these great coping behaviors. We see other dogs, not that big of a deal. And if for some reason it's too hard, we just leave. Right? But it's better working in that context than just going for a neighborhood walk and being like, oh my gosh, dog behind fence. Oh my gosh, loose dog in driveway. Like that becomes like a video game for a lot of my clients because they don't have control over the environment. So we talked about approved locations that he could practice, and we would meet there and work on it together. We worked on preventing his vision from, like, we can't have him working on this stuff and then putting the dog, watching other dogs walking by in the neighborhood and having him bark out the window. Like, that is really shooting ourselves in the foot because we're teaching him not to do that, and yet he's rehearsing that during the day. So it's a really manage the inside of the house. I had to teach Josh a ton of skills: environmental awareness, how to hold the leash, when to deliver the food, where to deliver the food, the mouth or the floor, the timing of his marker, right? When to create distance, when to push and see if Monty can do it. I mean, like, so many skills. And this poor guy was like, I just kind of want a dog, and I saw him People Magazine, and now he's got to learn all of this stuff. And he's had dogs his whole life, but he's now having to do this in a more complex situation. And he was, I will say, so good about being like, yeah, I don't understand this. Like, show me again, right? Which is so critical for our success as a team, because if he doesn't get it, I don't live with him and Monty. I leave, and he's taking care of Monty and doing all of this behavior modification. So I told you, our exit strategies when Monty was getting too overstimulated or over threshold, and we identified what that looked like based off his body language, we would run away and play find it, toss food on the floor. And then we were teaching him how to disengage from triggers. And then honestly, the pulling just decreased as he got better. And we used a no pull harness. So this is the engage, disengage game. So this is Titan, another reactive dog client of mine. And we are in a park where we can see all the vantage points so that he can pay attention. Oh wait, that's not on. So this is, so he looks at the trigger, looks back at mom, like an entry. She's a little bit late. So we're allowing him to watch things. The old way we used to do this is like, watch me, don't look, don't look. I know there is a terrorist across the street, but you cannot look, right? It's so scary for the dogs. They're just like, Dogs also don't have to sit. That is another mistake we make all the time. I'm gonna step off the trail and make you sit. And you have to focus on me, and you have to stay stationary, even though there's a scary thing. Could you imagine if someone came in here and I was like, nobody move? They're standing here with like a gun. I mean, like, you need to move. You need to move your body. Your body is anxious. You need to expel that energy. So we don't cue the dogs to sit or be stationary. If they offer it, that's a really good sign that they are willing and available to be stationary despite the fact that another trigger is present. So this is Monty 2 months ago. This is at the Humane Society of Boulder. We were trying to work on getting him greeting other dogs. We had been working together for months. So from November to, this was probably like in end of May or June. And we had been working on his leash, his behavior on leash this entire time. To the point where he was just like, it's another dog, I don't care, right? Oh, dogs are charging me from behind the fence. You got nothing on me, right? Like he was doing really, really well on leash. And then we were like, okay, let's see if we can introduce him to another appropriate helper dog, right? I love the choices Monty made here. So I'm gonna play this.
Yes, good job.
You'll hear me mark and reinforce every time he disengages from the other dog.
Okay. Yes, good
Yeah, good boy.
job.
Yeah.
Dog is over there.
Oh, I mean, he's also. Oh my gosh. Is he
Grass is like a real life snuff mat.
to get in to come over here? To come over here? Yeah.
Dog, he's like, I'll check it out first.
I want to be mindful of your bones and your like you.
This dog is that my handler has,
Do you want to walk
like
in?
Doofy
Like,
Lab, like coming in like gangbuster. Like he's just like. So I introduced. Do you see her? Like a poor woman. So what we were trying to work on, lovely choice.
So good.
What we were trying to work on is, do we want to introduce Monty to this dog? Does Monty want to meet that dog?
Yeah.
No, right? Like he's laying down and sees the dog and says, cool. And check it. Then he like literally walks towards the exit. Right? These are things that
This is not like no thank you.
really important and like,
What do you think about him? What do you think?
trying to keep the leash really slacked. So I had to tell Josh, like, yeah, no, we're not introducing him. He said, I see you, and I would prefer not. He like got up and created more space away from the other dog. That's really, really, really huge, right? And a lot of what we get Shelter Play Group Alliance teach other people is that like lots of times we're putting dogs into like play situations that like the dog was like, yeah, no, I actually didn't consent to this interaction, right? And so we got him closer to some dogs that day, but he was very clear about like, see you and I will say another day, right? So this is what that behavior looks like after months of us working on it under threshold as best we can, right? What I had Josh do was we started to do neighborhood walks. Josh would practice a little bit in front of his house, walk down the street, practice, come back to the house. Call this sort of like rubber banding. You go out and you come back. Practice a little bit in front of the house. We maybe go to the other way and then come back. We also brought nose work into the front of the house to change his association to the front of the house. Because the front of the house was like, I walk outside and I get hypervigilant. And so I was like, okay, you need to come outside and dip your head down to the ground and start searching so that we're modifying this hypervigilance, right? So this is, I mean, amazing work. He's doing amazing job here. And this is after several months, right? Like 6 months. This is, Josh wound up doing a dog introduction.
I'm going to show this to my trainer. Yeah, Monty, good boy.
So if we go frame by frame, Monty's actually avoiding a little bit. There's a great resource I'm going to send you all. The Shelter Playgroup Alliance just did a video of it. It's Playvows. Playvows have 2 functions. One to solicit play and one to diffuse conflict. And I feel like some of the things that Monty was doing there, where he's like playvowing and trying to walk away and looking away, and he does a little bit of like coexisting / avoidance / playvowing some of that younger dog's attempts to engage with him, and that's often misinterpreted as play. Do I think Monty could maybe have a relationship with this dog? I do. I do think that like this could be less conflicted moving forward. I just think that it's going to be really specific for Monty, that like the introduction's done really well, and it's done like he has a bunch of first dates with other dogs, like in parallel, before he can actually just be off leash with other dogs. And they have to be appropriately chosen, right? This, I believe, is a male, an adolescent male. Like that's pretty stinking good considering his history in the shelter, right? But this dog did, like, I saw other video, and this dog did listen to his avoidance cues eventually. So I think that that's why he made better choices around this dog. Hold on. Okay, I'm like, wait, what just happened? Okay, so in summary, pet parent can manage leash walks in the neighborhood. He's going on walks in his neighborhood now. He stopped the rubber banding. He's just going around, right? He like the dog, he can deal with it. The dog can deal with it, and therefore they like. Will he have a moment where he might fixate on something? Sure. Like, is Josh going on walks without food? No. Right? And I don't know if he ever will. Right? We want to make sure we have that reinforcer to mark the appropriate behaviors. Talk about a drag for adopters. They're like, well, I don't have to use treats. I always find this fascinating. It's like, you'll grab the shock collar remote, but you won't grab treats. Like, why? Why is that? But what I'm saying is that some adopters don't want to have food with them, right? I mean, Josh is so great. He's like, got his little satchel, looks super cool, and smells of hot dogs, right? And so he's come a long way with Monty. He might still react depending on the condition. He's choosing his locations on where to bring him carefully. And like I said, he could have dog friends, but it just depends on the dynamic. This is where we ran into some issues with introductions to people. And he had many challenging interactions. We actually worked on desensitizing him to a muzzle. So I was pretty concerned about some of the choices he's made, and I'm going to go over them. We had to go through like a trial and error process, because it was like he had problems with people in his backyard, he had problems with people in the house, in the front yard. We would then meet off site away from the house in a neutral spot, but then like we can't control the environment, right? So it was really a trial and error process that Josh and I had to go through with his loving, willing friends that were like, okay, I'm just going to sit here and listen to Marissa tell me what to do, as this dog is clearly uncomfortable, right? And so we had to figure out the best location which ended up being his backyard. And this was where I had to work with Josh with slowing down the video and making Josh like stellar canine body language reader. Because Monty was really good at being like, yeah, I see the person's over there and I don't want to. But that's not an obvious thing that most of us pay attention to with dogs. Avoidance, we don't pay attention to that. And so I had to really slow down video, and you're gonna hear me narrate a video that I did with Josh. I would video and then I would slow it down and narrate, and I would send it to him, and he'd be like, oh my gosh, wow, this is why this happened, right? And then we had to be really stellar with our management, right? How are we gonna prevent these negative interactions from taking place? Meeting new females, lovely. No problem, coming to the house, brand new people, brand new females, low risk behaviors. Barking and lunging during several introductions with new people, even with me. I remember coming to the house, he came flying out of the house, barking and lunging, and then he, like, I guess maybe recognized, I don't really know what happened in his brain, but then he softened, really relaxed the body postures and came up to me. He did an intro with a male friend, and what happened was that the dog was barking and lunging. Josh walked the dog closer to the male. Monty jumped up and ripped part of his coat. So made contact, but not breaking skin. He did an intro with a female cleaning person in the backyard. Monty heard her coming in the backyard, was really agitated. He like pushed past Josh through the door, right? Mistakes happen. And walked up to her and nipped her hand. And that was just a scream. And then there was he had a 6-foot privacy fence. Kid popped over, put his head over, so he had a floating head. Dog rushed, charged, so close distance, barking and lunging at the child from inside the backyard. And then this was the scariest one, where he pushed through the front door, because mistakes happen, right? All of these are just like weird, random, mistakey things, right? Ran out the front door, charged a woman across the street. Like, that would be really scary. She ran inside her house, and every time he charged, he would always stop, thank goodness, like with a perimeter around the person. So he never like ran up right to the door or like was trying to jump up to get the kid. But guys, this is like, we got some significant high risk behaviors happening with this dog as he's getting more comfortable in the house. So this didn't crop up until like, I would say like month 2 or 3 working with him. It was like a series of these just really poor interactions. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, his leash reactivity feels like a dream. Like, now I'm concerned this dog is closing distance and, you know, really, oh, great question. Miguel asked, how prepared would you say Josh was going into this journey? I would say that Josh was prepared with the information that he knew from the shelter. So he was prepared, meaning like, you're gonna have to be really cautious how you introduce it to people. Like, he's not a dog park dog. Like, I would say that Kenora did a really good job sharing that information. I wasn't even really prepared for this, given what I met about this dog. Like, I was like, wow, this is really escalating. Like, this is like, I don't know, it felt like as he was getting more comfortable, things were escalating. And it was also at the same time that like we were starting to open his world up a bit more, which is what we're seeing with the COVID dogs all the time, right? Is that like, wait, people come to this house? What do you mean people come to this house? And so I would say Josh they did a good job preparing him, but this level of concern, no, I don't think he could have been.
Was that part of their approval process? Like, do they make reference phone calls? Did they, or are they kind of an open adoption where they know what they are? Okay.
Yeah, open adoption for sure. So we've got moderate to high management requirements with this dog. We've got offensive behavior. Like, I mean, Woman was literally in her driveway doing nothing to the dog. Ran out, charged her, right? So it's not defensive. She wasn't doing anything to offensive behavior. We've got multiple triggers. We don't know, it's happening in a variety of contexts. It's kind of hard to predict. So now we've got like really high risk behaviors with a high risk management plan, right? So do you see how you can use this with all behavior? So we needed to do a bunch of trial and error, and like I said, we used a lot of different, we used a lot of his friends, paid them off with beer, and really tried to set up what would be the appropriate, like, does this dog want to meet a ton of people? Depends. But Josh wanted to at least try, like, okay, I can't keep him away from people entirely in his life. Like, is there something we could be doing differently to help him cope with these situations? And so I'm going to show you this video. This is his backyard. Thank goodness for this big backyard he had. This is the enrichment space. So the enrichment space that we set up at the shelter. And then Josh's mom is over here. Somebody he knows. It's really fascinating what he does. So I'm going to be quiet.
So you do a really good job of just walking right near the enrichment stuff. So moving right there and keeping him close to you. Reloading the boxes, that's perfect. At this point, I ask you to remember to mark, so say yes and reinforce him for any engagement. He can choose to bark if he wants. And so when he makes choices of going into the boxes and engaging with the environment and checking in with you, like that was an opportunity to mark and reinforce. And you're tossing into the box, that's great.
This is in slow motion, by the way, just in case anyone.
So he looks at you, you mark and reinforce, that's perfect. And notice how he looks at your mom there for a moment and looks away and then looks back at you. You marked and reinforced. That was a great regulation response. And notice that the leash is really slacked and that he is not making any moves towards her. He's actually remaining in place. Looks over at her, looks back at you. You mark and reinforce that. That was great. So this is what I would ideally like to see because he is in a really good place. Then we get closer, he engages in the enrichment toy, and this is at which point you ask him to move forward, and he's already communicating that he doesn't want to move forward. So what happens is you move forward, then he follows, and he's staying with you, then he realizes someone's there. Do you see how then he closes his mouth, his lips move forward in the bark? He's bouncy, but that felt really conflicted to me, especially because he then moved away. You did a great job of asking him to find it, but notice again, when he's further back, he's not pulling to get towards her. Right in this moment, he realizes he's close. He looks up, his mouth is closed. He looks back at you, his mouth is closed here. He freezes for a moment and then looks away. And his ears are back. All of that is I do not want to engage, especially because he moved away. So I think that that bounce was more conflicted rather than really wanting to engage.
Questions about that video? Really subtle, right? Yeah, so we did, so the question is, if he doesn't want, I remember, if he doesn't want to meet anyone, then do we just not have him meet anyone? And like the fast answer is, yeah, we don't. Because the more we force the interaction, the likelihood it's going to be negative, and then that's one more negative experience to add to his thesis paper about why people are really dangerous. And so we did a ton of coexisting, like to the point where like he would only initiate saying hello. And he would sometimes coexist in a yard with Josh sitting in a chair and his friends over there. And he would just hang with Josh on leash, laying down. He would coexist beautifully. We needed to do a lot of parallel activities before we ever brought him any closer. And it usually wasn't us bringing him closer. It was him making the choice to bring himself closer. So this is why I slowed down that video and went frame by frame with Josh to be like, hey, here are all these things that are happening. Especially the leash slack. Like this dog, I think, is so great at being like, yeah, I see you and I don't really care. Like a socially motivated dog would not just like, no matter what treats you have, if they really are socially motivated, they might pull past the person that they see all the time and spend time with to go see that new person, right? Monty was really clear about like, yeah, I see her. I don't want anything really to do with her. And I think that was my goal was really teaching Josh to stop forcing the social interaction, make it be more parallel, and go at Monty's pace. And I will tell you, Monty's met a bunch of people now and can actually be around people, male friends, female friends. Like he just emailed me yesterday and he's been doing these intros like this, very similar to what we were doing at the shelter. And he's got friends within his circle. Would I take this dog to the brewery or would I take him to someone else's backyard or something like that? Like, no, because we can't control all of those things. But if he's slowly introduced in this way, in a really structured way, he can develop friends, if that makes sense. So yeah, what I asked Josh was big. Like, you have to stop pushing these dogs together or pushing this dog into social interactions. And sometimes he would be like, well, I just want to try something, right? And then he finally was like, you know what? I've tried a few things. They're negative experiences. I really do need to just like quit it. And I don't think Josh was like ill-intentioned. I think he was like, I can't live in my house by myself, right? Like, I mean, the cleaning lady's coming over. Like, we had to have a whole process for that. Desensitizing him to the crate, putting him away in another room. Like, he doesn't even need to meet the cleaning lady, right? Or cleaning person. So he can have people in his circle, but it took several months to get him there. Great question. Other questions? Yeah, there's a question on here from the lovely Megan Dilmar. If this dog came into the shelter with this history, I don't think our organization would be comfortable rehoming him with you. No, I wouldn't. We've got a variety. Now we have way more information about this dog in the home. He's closing distance. He's made contact with several different people. Probably not. Did you notice that a lot of his behavior with people, it was like 1 through 6, depending on the scenario when he was in the shelter. And then it was like heavy and high risk behavior and heavy and high risk management when he got into the house, right? So this is why I think this is really important, this scale, so you can say, when you're talking to a staff member, here's why this dog's behavior and risk level is way different now that he's been returned to the shelter than when he was adopted, right? And Josh and I had that conversation. I said, hey, listen, if you need to not move forward with this dog, we'll have this conversation. I don't want you to feel trapped. You adopted this dog. He was in People magazine. Like, I mean, could you imagine like the guilt and the, feeling trapped into keeping this dog? They celebrated him on Facebook, all these things. And I said, listen, if you do not want to move forward with this dog, we will get through this together. And he was like, thank you for saying that. That's not what I want to do, but like, thank you for giving me that space to like have all the emotions, right? But he's doing so awesome.
Did you
Go ahead.
ever have Monty on any anti-anxiety medication?
We had a long conversation about pharmaceuticals because I had suggested we work with a vet behaviorist in Boulder, and Josh was a little hesitant. His vet was interested in talking to the vet behaviorist about which pharmaceuticals we would try. Josh was a little hesitant. He did try some CBD, which I'm like hit or miss about. There's other nutraceuticals or supplements that I like before CBD. We saw a little bit of a difference. And no, he made a lot of progress. We didn't have to. But yeah, that was definitely part of the plan.
Then would you consider his scooting stereotypical behavior?
Yeah, his scooting, it like happened like maybe like once every other day, and it usually happened when he had to poop. Like, I wouldn't say it's stereotypical because it wasn't really, really consistent in frequency, and we could interrupt it very easily. What I'm saying, like shadow chasing or light chasing, or like there was another dog at Kenora at this time that would lick the roof of the little house that he had consistently. Whenever someone approached the kennel, he would start licking the top of the structure that was in there, and it was really hard to interrupt him. Yeah, the question. So Josh adopted November, June, what is today? August. We stopped consistent training sessions in June. That last training session that you saw when I was at the Humane Society when we were trying to introduce him with other dogs, that was our last session. And I just got an update from him yesterday. He's doing really, really well in all these contexts. Like he's gaining dog friends, he's gaining human friends. It's all managed and, organized in a way that has rules and structure and all of this the way that we have done. But it is definitely a huge improvement. So in summary, aggression is always an option. So we're not breaking animals, even horses, we're not breaking animals out of behavior. Like it's not a thing. Aggression is always an option. We're just reducing the probability that it's taking place. Management and always being a keen observer will always be in Josh's world. And what is tricky about dogs that make progress is that the adopter is like, oh my gosh, she's doing so well. And they drop their guard, and that's when something happens. That's what happened when with the whole bite to the child with my dog, right? You're like, oh wow, he's doing so great for years. He's doing so great, and then this happens. Monty's desires might not match Josh's desires at times, so there's a lot of compromise. It's like, I ask Josh all the time, like, I know you want to take him to this party or this gathering in a backyard, but like, let's interview Monty and ask him what he might. The answer is no. He's super cool hanging at home with a crate. If you feel really guilty about it, film him in the crate, and he's probably sleeping, which 9 times out of 10 he is, right? So there's a lot of stories that we make up that the dog should be doing something. So Josh and I had talked about like, how can we compromise, or how can they compromise? Okay. Questions? Was that helpful to see a case from like in the shelter all the way out? Because we don't really talk a lot about what happens to these animals outside the shelter. I mean, maybe we call them, but like this is a guy that really committed to do hardcore behavior modification and amazing results and a lot of time and money, right? Was there other questions on here? I felt like there was. No, it's just Miguel again, chattering. Miguel. Questions? Do you think that some of its behaviors could have stemmed from living in a shelter environment for 1,000 million trillion %? Yeah, I think the reactivity and how he's always forced to engage with people and dogs in a way that like was not good, and he learned a lot of great behaviors that would make them go away, right? And so yeah, I 100% agree that a lot of this could have been from like cultivated because of the shelter environment, for sure.
At what point did you meet?
Oh, I met him. So if he was adopted in November, I met him in August. So I met him at like 22 months living in the shelter. And then I was like, oh, wow. They're like, this is our longest stay. Can you help us with him? And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. I was like, we need to do something for this dog. And no one would transfer him, right? Because of the pity and the bite to the dog and all the things, right? So I met him at 22 months, and then he was adopted 2 months later, right at the 2-year mark. Yeah.
So hypothetically, he did come back to you after that no history, would you be willing to work with him again, or would he have to be hurt?
Given if Josh were to relinquish him,
Just said no, brought him back to the shelter, doing one more thing, would you be willing to work with those issues? Would you be able to work with them in the shelter?
yeah, no, I think he'd be a euthanasia candidate. If he came to DFL, for sure, he'd be a euthanasia candidate. Oh yeah, I think the question is that like if after this home history with Josh, and Josh was like, I can't do this anymore, and brought him back to either Kenora or DFL or HPPR or wherever, in my professional opinion, he would be a euthanasia candidate. Yeah, it's just too. It's like it was enough for Josh. Josh and I didn't have that conversation because I was not going to. I didn't want him to feel. I wanted to give him the option, like, hey, if you cannot do this, we will have the conversation. But I didn't say, hey, if you cannot do this, yeah, he's gonna be a euthanasia candidate, because that would like trap him even more. I didn't actually have that conversation with him, and he will watch this recording. So I did that on purpose so he could really explore what he needed to explore. And he was like, within several days, like, no, I'm committing to this dog. But if he came to a shelter, then yeah, I think he'd be a euthanasia candidate because the risk was really high given his human interactions. Huh? One of the most difficult things for us is that most of our animals are stray with no home history. It is impossible to tell if the behavior is situational and if they will dissipate or worsen once adopted. These are by far the most difficult outcome decisions for us. Can I ask a specific resource guarding related question? Yes. Yes, you can, Megan. Yeah, I mean, the home history is tricky, right? Because we didn't have a lot of home history on Monty either. We were like, and this is the thing where it's like, when people say all these animals need is love, like, honestly, did Monty need any love? He was like super cool, like not needing anyone to engage with him. He actually would prefer that space. And so I think it's really important for us to, like, we're all making decisions with the information that we have, and we're trying the best that we can. I wouldn't have been able to predict this, right? Like we can't. Who knows? Like if that dog got adopted to like a home with kids, like I mean, like the conditions matter, right? It's so important. The environmental conditions matter. And going to what Megan is saying, like, yeah, if you have a dog with a stray history and you're just seeing what's happening in the shelter, like, yeah, it's a total bummer. I mean, like, there's ways to get that animal off site, get them in home environments, but even those resources are few and far between. I mean, who here has found the answer to behavior foster for large dogs? Like, no one wants to do it, right? So, yeah, it's hard, but we're trying the best that we can with the information that we have. If a dog shows resource guarding on assessment with no home history, significantly, so like leaving the bowl to bite the hand, how do you make a euthanasia decision with that one piece of information? I think it would depend on, all the other factors about that dog. Like, how is the dog with new people? How is the dog with dogs? How is the dog with other resources? I don't think I can't make a decision on one piece of information. If that dog left the bull to bite somebody and has problems with their dogs and is like kennel reactive towards people, that would be a clear possible euthanasia decision if I didn't have any home history, than if it was just this isolated incident. If it was just the isolated incident, like I feel like I'd want to do some office time for that dog with some lower value resources with the assess a hand and just get a sense of like, okay, when you're out of this environment and you're in an office and you're more relaxed or a training environment and I have a resource around, can you trade it? You know, could I use the assess a hand to test you in that environment? We don't do resource guarding testing at DFL, and so I really haven't had to wrap my head around that. But traditionally the dogs, in my colleagues' experience, traditionally the dogs that like do significant resource guarding, there's other behavior concerns that we're seeing in other areas. And that's how they make the decision. It's not just that the dog left the bull to bite the hand, if that makes sense. So that's a real clear, let's say otherwise fine. Well, define fine, Megan. Yeah, otherwise fine. So maybe no issues. She said nope. Yeah, I think I couldn't make a decision on that test because of all the false, like the research doesn't necessarily support that, like there's a lot of false positives in that situation. So I think I'd want to get that dog in other environments with trusted staff, and I'd want to set, like, I might even have the baby gate dogs over there and I do the assess a hand with something. Like, I don't think I could make that decision just on that one instance in time, if that makes sense. I'd want to get that dog into a variety, into other settings that are less stressful and do another setup organically to see if that changes. Clear as mud, I think. Would you use different resources too, like comms or something similar? Like, yeah, I mean, and I have done that, like really, it hasn't been like, I'm gonna give you a comm, I'm gonna walk away, I'm gonna get my assess a hand, and I'm gonna go and do this. I've not done that. I've just had the assess a hand often, like I've desensitized, like I would leave the assess a hand out, dog would sniff it, habituate to it, get used to it, and then I would just have it or whatever. If like, you know, I did this actually with a 4-month-old puppy. If I dropped like a pen on the floor, be like, you know, if you go for that pen and I try to take it away. And what happened was with this 4-month-old puppy, guarded water, any fallen object, food on the ground. Most times resource guarders, like if there's like a dropped piece of crumb, they won't guard that because it's not really theirs. But if they have the food bowl and they have the Kong and whatever, it's theirs. Yeah, I think I would try a bunch of organic situations with safety measures in place. I remember talking through that case with you. Yeah, we wound up euthanizing that puppy because I was like, this is everything. And like left the resource. That's the thing like that Megan is talking about. There's something very different when a dog has something and is like low growling, but like actually leaves the resource to close distance and bite someone. That's really risky, right? Like it's leaving the resource to close distance and make contact, and then it depends on what that bite is. So yeah, and I will answer that as I'm processing this out loud in my extroverted mind is if that bite like made contact and caused, I mean, who knows what that bite is? Was it several times? Was it like multiple like snaps? Was it punctures? I don't know if I'm going to put this dog in another room with myself with the assessing hand and set up organic scenarios to see. Like it depends on all like the effort at which the dog exuded to create distance increasing opportunities for the dog. Does that make sense? The effort at which an animal engages is should be part of that risk analysis too. Okay. Hilarious, Megan. Love you too. To Megan. Okay. Hopefully you all will take the intake forms, the body language resources, the risk assessment, the summary, and utilize it at your facility if you want. If you're interested in that, or if you want me to if you want to talk about that separate, I'm happy to do that. Work with a few shelters to integrate it into their process. Happy to connect with you. And hopefully this presentation is really near and dear to my heart because I've not seen somebody walk a specific animal through the whole process. And I think it's really important for us as shelter professionals to see that, to really understand all of what goes into that. And there are people that are willing to do it. And yeah, so thank you for your time today. Thank you.
If you were in the room here, did all of you sign up through Sign Up Genius? Let me ask you, did anybody not sign up? Yes, I'm going to use that to make sure you get the resources. Thank you all. Yeah.
Totally.
Thank you. For Jasper. Yeah.
Just to see, like, we're gonna that's cleared up. I don't know. We can't figure out why he's leaking. He literally is. Like,
Yeah, I know. Oh, Miss Gatsby.
but